The two Lebanese wars were to Israel what the Vietnamese quagmire was to the USA, a seemingly endless disaster. For almost 20 years, with over 500 deaths and thousands wounded, Israel labored to try and bring peace and quiet to its northern border with Lebanon. Before examining each of the wars on their own, a brief overview is necessary. Katyusha rockets and terrorist infiltrations were not new to the northern border. The first rockets which rained down on Kiryat Shmone can be traced back as far as 1968. After the PLO had been driven out of Jordan in the late 1970s and turned southern Lebanon into a state within a state, civil war soon followed. Israel had had enough. These were also the first years of the new right-wing government under Menachem Begin, whose Likud party had, against all odds, defeated the alignment, the Ma'arach, in the 1977 general election. The First Lebanon War, known as Shlom HaGalil, Peace for the Galilee, or known in Lebanon as the Invasion, was precipitated by numerous incidents caused by the PLO, the final straw being the attempted assassination of the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom, Shlomo Argov. The military operation was launched on the 6th of June 1982. The final objectives of the war were clearly defined. There was a belief that once the PLO were expelled from Lebanon, Israel would help set up a Maronite-dominated Lebanese government, with Bashir Gemayel, the Christian leader of the Maronites, as president. After attacking the PLO as well as Muslim Lebanese forces, supported by the Syrians settled in the Bekaa Valley, the Israeli military, in cooperation with the Maronite allies and the self-proclaimed Free Lebanon State, occupied southern Lebanon, eventually surrounding the PLO and elements of the Syrian army. Surrounded in West Beirut and subjected to heavy bombardment, the PLO forces and their allies negotiated passage from Lebanon with the aid of the United States Special Envoy Philip Habib and the protection of international peacekeepers. The PLO, under the chairmanship of Yasser Arafat, relocated its headquarters to Tripoli in June 1982. By expelling the PLO, removing Syrian influence over Lebanon, and installing a pro-Israeli Christian government led by President Bashir Gemayel, Israel hoped to sign a treaty which Menachem Begin promised would give Israel 40 years of peace. However, it became clear after the war, the findings of the independent inquiry which had been set up to investigate whether Israel was complicit in the horrific massacres which took place in the Muslim refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, that Begin had been misled by Defense Minister Arik Sharon. Begin believed that Israel was going to set up a 40-kilometer defense area to protect the northern border from Palestinian missiles. The military plan, codenamed Big Pines, envisaged an invasion by the IDF to the Damascus-Beirut highway, linking up with the Christian Maronite forces. This was rejected by the Israeli cabinet, which adopted a compromise by Sharon and Raful Eitan, the chief of staff, which would implement the plan in stages, and was finally authorized on the 4th of June. Begin referred to the plan as self-defense to avoid another Treblinka. Thus, on the 6th of June 1982, Israel launched Operation Peace for Galilee, with 60,000 troops, more than 800 tanks, and supported with aircraft, attack helicopters, and naval missile boats. The publicly stated aim was to push the PLO forces back 40 kilometers to the north. One division moved along the coast, and a further 2 divisions pushed forward in the center to the high ground overlooked by the Beaufort Castle, which was used by the PLO as a strategic stronghold and became an infamous word in Israeli jargon after an impromptu press conference at the battle site by Begin and Sharon. Before they knew of the casualties, Arik Sharon, the defense minister, proclaimed that the battle had been won without any Israeli casualties. In fact, 6 soldiers had been killed and 21 wounded. Heavy numbers for an Israeli unit. Begin had asked, did they have machine guns? A question which later became a symbol of how uninformed the Israeli leadership was of the events on the front throughout the war. The easternmost force, the largest of the 3, advanced into the Bekaa Valley. Its aim was to prevent the Syrians from sending troops to interfere with the operation. Initially, the Syrians offered little resistance, and the Israeli forces made headway to the Beirut-Damascus highway, the key strategic point in the battle. By the end of the first day, the operation had gone almost entirely to plan, although the forces on the coastal road were behind schedule. The elite naval forces of Shayetet 13 were used to overcome the PLO forces. The main battle in the central theatre between the Israelis and the Syrians took place at Jezim, which took the Israelis a full day of intense fighting to overcome the Syrian forces. In the following days there were various skirmishes until the Israelis encountered a Syrian ambush at the town of Sultan Yaqub. The Israelis managed to extricate their forces, but lost 10 tanks and 3 armoured personnel carriers. The Air Force was called in and a major air battle took place, in which Israel shot down 25 Syrian jets and 4 helicopters. On the 11th of June, Israel and Syria agreed on a ceasefire, which did not include the PLO. It did not last, and Israel shot down another 18 Syrian planes. Israeli forces continued to advance towards the Beirut International Airport as the PLO situation deteriorated. However, the TV images of Israeli Air Force planes bombing the civilian airport of Beirut, which appeared nightly on TV in the sitting rooms of the homes of people all over the world, caused outrage. This was the first time that a major westernish city was bombed and seen in color. This had a major impact on bringing pressure to bear on Israel to cease the war. On the 13th of June, a ceasefire was announced which did not last very long. On the 15th of June, Israel offered free passage to the PLO if they would withdraw to the Bekaa Valley, which was immediately rejected by the Syrians. Since the Syrians still controlled the Beirut-Damascus highway, on the 22nd of June the IDF launched an attack to capture the highway, and by the 25th of June the Syrians had begun withdrawing their forces. The siege of Beirut had begun on the 14th of June. The Israelis preferred to keep the city surrounded and in siege rather than to send troops into the city, which would cost many lives and cause worldwide outrage. The siege was to last until August, when an agreement was reached allowing 14,000 PLO combatants to be evacuated from the city, which was to be overseen by an international peace force known as the Multinational Force in Lebanon. This was perceived as the formal end to the war, but the troubles were far from over. In the south, Hezbollah became the preeminent Islamic militia. On the 14th of September 1982, Bashir Gemayel, the newly elected president of Lebanon, was assassinated. Israeli troops immediately occupied West Beirut. The Lebanese Christian militia, also known as the Phalangists, were allies of Israel at this time. The Israeli command authorized over 100 Phalangist fighters to enter the PLO refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, where they believed almost 3,000 terrorists were hiding. Between 460 and 3,500, the exact number is not known, mostly Palestinian and Lebanese Shiite civilian women and children were massacred. In Israel, the Kahan Commission of Inquiry was set up and found that Arik Sharon, the defense minister, bore personal responsibility for failing to prevent the massacre and for failing to act once he knew the massacre was underway. The commission recommended that he be removed from his role as defense minister and should never be allowed to hold any future role in any Israeli government. Sharon resigned but remained in the cabinet as a minister without portfolio. Several years later, Sharon was to become prime minister. The First Lebanon War ended with Israel occupying a large swathe of southern Lebanon, which was to act as a buffer protecting the northern border. But it was to be a cancer, eating at the very heart of Israeli society, and was to take another war and years of occupation before Israel finally withdrew from Lebanon.